not sure when he will arrive, and I don't anticipate we'll be making any decisions right in the early part of the meeting. So the meeting. Excuse me?
Can you all hear?
Is that better? All right, thank you. We'll just say that Dr. Freitas will be arriving. Mr. Sandifer and Mr. Shepard are not going to be attending today. In calling the meeting to order, I would like to just remind us of our charge, which I think we all know in general, but stress again that we are charged with making two recommendations, one for expenditure of funds in fiscal year 2009, and another for making recommendations to the legislature on possible policies they might adopt for the long term for 2010 and beyond. And that in the governor's charge to us, the words that are used are success, outcomes, and achievements as opposed to processes and other things. In the testimony we've heard from people such as Dr. Dennis Jones and ourselves and the various representatives from the universities, we've heard over and over again words like unambiguous, simple, predictable, sustainable, no upfront, fewer rather than more goals, all sectors can legitimately participate. That was from Dr. Jones. Simple, minimum level of bureaucracy, referring to databases that already exist so as not to provide for a new bureaucracy, statewide goals and such that each institution can focus on different goals depending on its own role and mission. That came from the previous committee for general academic incentive funding. And then words like quantifiable, consistent and predictable over long periods, simple, not requiring excessively burdensome administration and data collection, balanced, not overstressing one subset of outcomes at the extent of others. That was from the prior health institution, and I think we've more or less agreed on those. Moving forward, the first piece of paper under the agenda itself is a summary of the meeting that was prepared by the governor's staff for May 7th. And this has been distributed to the committee. It summarizes the governor's staff's understanding of what we tentatively voted to move forward with. I'd remind you that our vote was always regarded as subject to re-examination at the end. But I would invite you to take a few minutes and see if there are any aspects of the summary that require clarification or that you believe do not accurately reflect where we stood at the end of the last meeting.
I have a question. I apologize for being handicapped at the last meeting, but this second paragraph, discussed but not acted upon, that the $100 million would be increased to $140. Do we have that ability, or is that a just will be we're gonna recommend the 100, and also if there is extra money or something along those lines, how will that actually?
I'm going to ask Mr. Roberts to clarify that we have received some informal invitations to make recommendations if there was additional funds.
Good afternoon, members. Yes, you are requested to recommend what you would consider to be an amount, a total amount, and it can be above that $100 million. At the last meeting, I suggested that 140 may be a little bit optimistic, but we are, if you'll recall, looking for a formula or an allocation method that can be used to distribute any level of funding the governor and I believe other state leadership are interested in your recommendations as to how much should go to the community colleges, how much should go to the universities out of the $100 million plus some amount, as well as a recommendation for the amounts of money that the legislature should consider for incentive funding in the next legislative session.
Now, the rider on the appropriation bill for fiscal year 2009 talks about $100 million specifically, and talks about general academic campuses specifically, but the representatives from the LBD and the governor's office have indicated that they would be open to recommendations with regard to the two-year institutions as well, and that might bring us over the $100 million mark. I'd also remind you that the legislation, the rider on the appropriation bill, does allow for scholarships as part of the, presumably that would be scholarships for enrollees at general academic campuses according to the rider, but I would extrapolate from the invitation to consider two-year colleges that would also mean for scholarships at two-year colleges.
Okay.
Welcome, Dr. Paredes. We're glad you survived your hearing.
Yes, just got through testifying.
We have conducted no business thus far and are in the process of reviewing the staff-prepared summary of our last meeting to see if we're in agreement that accurately reflects where we came down. I would make one comment, and that is with regard to the 20 million, 80 million, 40 million. I think it was I who threw that out as a rough approximation of the relative funding levels, and I believe Mr. Hunt, with a better mental math ability than I had, calculated that perhaps 35 million for the two-year institutions would be more accurately the same percentage increase on the base than 40 million. That is something that we can deal with as we come to it. So there was nothing voted on with regard to 20, 80, and 40. That was just a thrown out suggestion. No conclusions about that. Below the underlying general academic teaching institutions were the items that we did indeed vote on, and that we will have a chance to reconsider if we wish.
Could someone clarify number 2 for me, just to make sure I'm clear on that, the second result of vote?
Any distribution of 2009 funds based on increased graduations will be done using a one-year increase instead of an average of 3 or 2 years. It was proposed that to minimize the ups and downs of any particular year's changes in graduation numbers, that a blended 2-year average might smooth things out. The committee voted on a mixed vote, however, to fund on a one-year increase basis. Again, that's something we can reconsider if we wish.
Mr. Chair, bullet 3 under paragraph 2, it references Lamar University State College. Are those the Lamar State Colleges?
Yes, sir.
Okay. University can be taken out of there, I guess.
Okay.
You're correct.
Okay.
So that's the proper title for the institutions in question is Lamar State College,
right.
Not Lamar University State College. Good. We will get that change made.
Colonel, would you want me to comment on the tier before or later on?
I think that would be a good turn.
Okay. Here's a handout. I know y'all think that the coordinating board is pretty headstrong, and we keep coming back to this tiered approach.
We know the coordinating board is
but I had the chance to only one.
Susan, we have some back there for the audit.
There's extras here.
I just want to make sure that we clarified to the committee, because as I traveled back home after our last meeting, I was a little bit concerned that maybe we had not done a good job of providing an explanation of the tiered approach. And if y'all remember, that's the second column of funding. And I guess, Woody, I was kind of going back to your comments also, and I want to make sure that when we put this together, what we did is we looked at the percentage improvement in each university, okay? In other words, if you had 1,000 degrees and you went to 1,100, that was a 10% increase, okay? And we did not set the incentives based upon the percentage improvements. We just used that percentage to put them in tiers. So, for instance, let's say if Sam Houston State had a 30% increase, they would be in the top tier. But if that only was 10 degrees, they only got incented on 10 degrees. In other words, they didn't get incented on the, so let's say, 30% increase. And I thought that was a little confusing because it sounded initially as if we were recommending incentives based upon per percentage improvement. The thought process was this, is that, and I'm not trying to go back and rehash this, but I want to make sure we clarify it. The first column was obviously rewarding everybody on a per degree basis for whatever you produce. The second is where we were really trying to put some incentive from what I define as pure incentive, and that is let's look and define who are our best producers, and let's pay our best producers more money. So if a small institution is doing something that is very dramatic, such as mentoring students, improving retention, all those issues, and a Sam Houston State, now that's not a good example, just an example, is driving out a 30% improvement one year, they're obviously doing something that is working. There's some best practices there. So the thought is, well, let's tier them up in those best producers, but let's only reward them on a per degree basis. And so, if you remember, our proposal was, in that situation, again, let's say Sam Houston State had a 30% improvement, and that was 10 degrees, they would get $100,000 because the first tier was 10, the second tier was 5, the bottom half was 2,500. So as I traveled home, I didn't know if we really did a good job explaining that. I thought I walked out here with everybody thinking, well, if you had a 30% improvement, you get compensated on a per degree improvement. And so I want to make sure that was clear. Again, I know we voted already, but I was a little bit concerned that maybe.
So it's premium pay per degree.
Per degree.
For being in that top
tier. And the logic there was we said, listen, and Kern and I had a conversation on Saturday. He brought some very good points also. But our thought process was, if we've got a group, the top 25%, really doing some really innovative things to improve, in that area, we want to reward that. So let's compensate them at a different level. And granted, they could drop out at the next year. The next year, they might only have a 2% improvement, or they're going to drop down. One thing Kern said was, if you're in that bottom half, can you ever get up into that top half? Or the top quarter. And my contention is, I think you have a better chance of getting up in that top quarter using the percentage improvement in terms of establishing what tier you fall in. But then you only get rewarded on the actual production you have. And so it's still, you're getting, rewarded on per degrees. And kind of gives some great points Saturday too.
And maybe we don't want to go through the whole debate again. Taking your example, and whether it's Sam Houston or Sul Ross or Midwestern or whatever, if in fact 10 increased graduations puts you in tier 1, but of the percentage, my point would be that suppose you only had 9, and that puts you in tier 2. So rather than get 10 graduates times $10,000 or $100,000, with one fewer graduate, you would get 9 times 5, only 45,000, and that introduces the opposite of what we said that we wanted, and that is simplicity and predictability and sustainability, that it could bounce around much more, and that there's really not necessarily a significant difference between 9 and 10 in any given year. And so that was one of my points.
And I think that's a great point. I haven't looked at I'm sure Susan has, but, our break points were, and that sheet we gave to you were 23 to 12% was the top tier, 10 to 6.6 was group 2, and then anything below 6.6. was group 3. Notwithstanding that situation, I do think that recommendation sets forth a lot of incentive for institutions to put in innovative ideas to drive percentage improvement to get up in there in that top category.
And my concern was, in making comments and looking at it in our last meeting, I mean, we had 3 different methods. One was our 3-year rolling average of total increases, or total graduates. Then we had our increases against the 3-year rolling average, and then we had the tiered approach. And when you look at the outcomes there, the tiered is, in a pure incentive sense, the one that puts the most incentives there. I mean, the variability went from 0 almost to 20%, went to 19.3 with Sam Houston State. When you look at the number of increase in graduates, the range from 0 to 11. You get down to the total number of graduates, the range is only 1.2 to 5.8. So I agree that from an incentive standpoint, it puts more incentives than our other 2 methods that we discussed. I think my concern is pretty well along the curve laid out. Simplicity, sustainability, understanding, in other words, predictability, were probably what caused me to lean against it. The other thing that was confusing, and what I was concerned about, is we were taking the most incentivized program, and the coordinating board was averaging it with the least incentivized program to come up with the recommendation to do the 09 fund. So in a sense, the debate that should have been taking place, I think, was on what are we going to do going forward. And I was being, at least, I think, influenced by, wait a minute, this is really getting confusing as far as how we're going to distribute the 09 fund. So I don't mind having more discussions, although I still have the same reservations about, is it too complex? But I do recognize that from an incentive standpoint, it is the one that certainly is going to get the most attention out there. Now, whether it's a politically is easy to understand and explain, and I mean, those are all issues that I think we need to take into consideration. I would have concerns there.
And I appreciate that. All I want to do is make sure. When I walked out here, I thought people were thinking, well, you're getting compensated based upon percentage improvement, and I was a little bit concerned we had not communicated that very well.
I understand it's the number. Totally irrelevant to the business at hand. I'm going to take off my coat because it's warm in here. I'm not anybody else to do it. Unless we can turn the air conditioner on.
We can turn it on.
The other point I would make, and not specifically with regard to tiering or anything else, is that we have incentives already, as we've reminded ourselves. Right now, the incentive is to enroll more students. And that incentive exists without a tiering, and it works. It works because it's simple, and it's sustainable, and it's predictable. And we don't, for example, say to UT Austin, because you enroll more students and you're in the top tier in total enrollment, you get 2x per enrollee compared to Sam Houston, which is in the middle, and Sam Houston and St. Ross, which is the lowest, gets 1/2 of x. We say a student is a student is a student, no matter whether you're in a big school or a little school. And that has worked. It gives an incentive for St. Ross to increase their enrollment, and it gives an incentive for everybody else to increase their enrollment if there's enough money attached to it. And so I believe there will be incentives if there's sufficient funds to incentivize. And the predictability of the enrollment incentive, if you will, is what makes it work. Because you can pretty well guess that if you invest in whatever is required to increase your enrollment 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, 8 years down the road, if you sustain an increased enrollment, you will sustain an increased funding.
And if I could just add a comment there. If you look back to closing the gaps, it was to close the gaps in participation, success, excellence, and research. And I agree with you that the formula works particularly well at the participation level. I think really our debate now is, do we need to tilt, or do we need to split some of the funds and focus them toward success, which we do as we weight it here, and even excellence as we do when we decided last time to include in include graduate degrees, and as we might do today when we talk about the health fields. And we've already got funds in place that are focused on the research. So, I mean, to me, we're in a journey here, and that journey has been done better on the participation than it has on the success. And part of what we do, how do we craft something that maybe gets a little bit more bang for the buck on the success side.
Okay. Moving on down the summary page, I would remind you that when we got to two-year institutions, the staff had provided a variety of runs based on a variety of weightings, a multitude of weightings, I guess I should say. And that of those various runs, we tentatively agreed that we would look at what was termed option 5 and option 7, which was the exact correlate of what we had voted on with regard to the general academic campuses. But we also thought that there were too many weightings and too wide a variety of weightings, and asked the staff to come back to us with some simplified and narrowed weightings, and they have done that, and in due course we'll come to that. If in general then we're satisfied with the summary, subject to taking out the word university after Lamar, and understanding that the $40 million is something that we have not really voted on or considered in depth. The next page in your handout is a view of what the results would yield, including all degrees, graduate and baccalaureate, this is for general academic campuses, with a doubling for critical fields and at-risk students, and a tripling if it was both. With graduate students, at risk drops out of the equation, and there's only the critical fields. And the table shows the 3-year average graduations and how $40 million would be proportionally distributed. And then the third column shows the increases, numerical increases, weighted, and how $40 million would be distributed based on that. And then the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th column would be the total funding earned by this 50-50 split with those weightings. And then the last 3 columns take that total funding earned and divide it by a denominator, and it's 3 different denominators. The first of those last 3 columns is percent increase in GR, and that's total GR, including special item funding and everything else. And the range is somewhere from around 1 to 10% increases. Or you could take that same total funding earned and divide it not by total GR, but by the increase in the operations formula, including the operations formula as it's funded both by GR and by dedicated tuition. The third column, which is the farthest to the right, takes the same numerator, and divides it by a denominator that is the GR that is devoted only to operations. So there is a requirement, basically, that tuition that is collected from the students by the institutions is part of education and general funds, and the total E&G funding is a combination of mandated tuition, not the flexible tuition, but the mandated tuition, and GR. And so that number will be different if you take just the GR component of operational formula funding, or if you take GR plus tuition. So depending on that, you'll find that by and large the same institutions are the relative winners and losers, but there's a little shift because of the nature of which get more special items and so forth. But if you take the second from the right, then the range, rather than being from 1 to 10% increase, if you take it just on the increase in operations, it ranges from about 1.8% to a high of 21.5%. And if you take it just on the GR portion of operations, then you're talking about a range that we would have recommended if this carries forward of 2.8% to over 30%. Now, to illustrate that, I have taken this data, which arrived a few days ago from the staff, and plotted out the percent increase in GR against an axis of the 3-year average of undergraduate and graduate degrees. In other words, how does it break out your likelihood of getting an increase depending on how big you are to start with? And so if I could, I will pass this out.
Thank you.
And this does not identify institutions, but perhaps it makes it easier. One sheet. And this is taking the third from the right column. And I think what it shows is that the largest institutions are not the ones getting the largest total blended increase, nor for that matter are the very smallest institutions the one getting the largest total blended increase. But it is the relatively smallish ones that tend to be in a position to get the greater increases. Now, if you take that very same data and compare it to the second from the right column, you get a related conclusion. And again here, this is the percent increase represented by the incentive funding by the tentative formula that we've adopted, plotted against the 3-year average undergraduate and graduate degrees weighted, but against all funds specifically appropriated for appropriations, including tuition. And there you can see that, in fact, the smaller institutions, as it happens, turn out to have relatively larger percentage increases than the larger institutions. And if you take then the far right-hand column and do the same kind of plotting, and this would be the increase in GR based on the incentive formula that we have tentatively adopted, plotted against the size of the institution as measured by the weighted degrees. Again, you'll see that there's a lot of variation all the way, again, from 3% up to 30%. But again, the larger institutions tend to be the lowest percentage increases, and it is the smaller institutions that have the most upside potential. So if our desire was to adopt a formula that provided more upside potential for the still growing institutions as compared to the more mature, perhaps nearing capacity institutions, then we have succeeded. If our desire was, on the other hand, to provide an equal opportunity for large or small institutions to qualify for incentive funding, then we seem to have stacked the deck against the larger institutions to a relative extent. I don't know what to do with that data, but I thought it would be worth having. One comment that I think is worth emphasizing for those of you who are not in the business of year-by-year expending the state funds that we receive is that when funds are appropriated for a given year, state funds, or revenue funds are appropriated for a given year, they are spent in that year. They are not carried forward. And so if we provide for an institution a 10 or 20 or 30%, depending on what denominator you want to use, increase in a given year, if that's not predictably able to be sustained in future years, as an academic administrator, I can tell you that we would be very careful not to put those funds into anything that requires an ongoing sustained source. Because, for example, if we were to hire a bunch of counselors to tutor students at risk to make sure they graduate, and we took our 30% increase or our 20% or 15 or 10% increase or whatever it was and used it for that purpose, and we're not sure that we would have that same relative amount of money in the succeeding year, we wouldn't do that, because we would find ourselves with a bolus of newly hired people, which a year later we would have to let go. So that in incentive funding for the 1 year FY 2009, I think we need to recognize that it's unlikely that the institutions will invest those funds on something that will require a long-term sustained investment as opposed to a one-time shot. And if they did, they probably would be foolish to do so. They probably will be happy to have the funds, whether it's 1% increase or a 30% increase. They'll spend it on something good and worthwhile, but something that is a this year need, not a long-term sustained investment in what I think our recommendation will likely want to be for the going forward years.
Attorney, if we have a self-imposed structure that essentially, and I think you've laid it out very well, that would work against the success of a long-term incentive program that needs to be sustainable, dependable, reliable, so that you can get investment today, even though the payback might be 3, 4, 5, or more years, which doesn't work in this annual or biennium at the most flexibility we've got. So it's one of our recommendations to the legislature for this to be successful, that these incentive funds need to be treated differently, and if that is one of the requirements to be successful, is that possible or realistic that they might be willing to buy into that treatment?
I personally think that is an absolutely crucial question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I think it'll require a dialogue, perhaps. History would show that appropriations that are authorized purely by rider are less likely to be sustained than appropriations that are authorized in statute. And so that might lean us toward recommending the statutory establishment of incentive funding.
Wayne, any thoughts?
Well, Dr. Woventhal's analysis is correct. The governor's proposal, now almost 2 years ago, did recommend statutory changes. We thought that, or enabling laws, we thought that as Dr. Woventhal said, provided better sustainability, gave it more oomph, if you will. But at the beginning of our development of our proposal, we acknowledged early on that it could all be done just through the General Appropriations Act as well, which is what the course that the legislature decided to take when the bill that was authorizing it got slowed down.
If I may, let me hand out one other analysis along these lines, which is not included in what the staff prepared. It harkens back to the recommendation of the Coordinating Board's Formula Advisory Committee for what was called not incentive funding, but performance funding. Personally, I don't draw a tight distinction between performance funding and incentive funding, but that's fine. This was what the Formula Advisory Committee proposed be set aside for $100 million for performance funding. The weights that were attached to that were 1.25. Any degree was 1. This is for general academic campuses again. Any degree was 1. At risk or important fields was 1.25, and both was 1.5, so the weightings were less extreme. And not surprisingly, therefore, the range of increase was less extreme, this time ranging between about 1% and 5%. If you take this recommendation and plot it against size as calculated by weighted brackets again, you get a scatter plot that looks slightly different than the ones that we voted on at our last meeting.
What was the critical field weighting on this one?
1.25.
And the at-risk?
1.25.
Oh, 1.25.
And both would be 1.5. Remember that correctly?
And were these total degrees?
Total degrees, including graduate. And on this, you can see that rather than if you tried to plot a line going up or down, you can see that it's relatively flat. There's still a wide variability, a five-fold variation, but it does not seem to particularly congregate along small schools versus large schools. Again, I don't know what to do with this data. It's just information. Here it's plotted not against the degrees, but against the base formula funding, which is what the coordinating board, the advisory committee uses its denominator. But that's more or less analogous. Big schools are big schools in money received and in graduates. And small schools are small schools for the same reason. So I'm going to suggest that we sort of just take this, look at it, throw it away, study it, reconsider based on it, whatever, when we come back to revisit. And for the next order of business, go on to the two-year institutions, where we have yet to make even a tentative recommendation, other than to recommend that we have less widely disparate weightings. And you have in your handout a piece of paper like this, which shows, again, each of the institutions, the 3-year average for weighted certificates, certificate 1s, which is a 1-year certificate or less, certificate 2s, transfer students, associate degrees, which would be weighted at 3, and critical fields and at risk of an additional 0.5. I think the handout previously ranged from sort of 1 to 7, so this is narrowed the range. The increase is in the second broad column, the total dollar figure that would result from the 3-year average, and the increase is in the third to the right column. And then the percent increase in GR for fiscal year 09 and the percent increase in instructional for fiscal year 09 is in the right-hand columns. Those numbers vary almost not at all for 2-year institutions, because 2-year institutions don't get all those other things that 4-year institutions get. They don't get special items so much, and they don't get other kinds of funding. So, in effect, it doesn't quite matter a whole lot whether you're looking at percent of GR or percent of instruction. It's going to be more or less the same percentage. Now, if you, in fact, then follow that same principle and plot out how the percent increases, this is in GR, but it could have been the other, compared to the size of the institution, you can see that, in fact, it is quite a bit flatter than for the general academics. There are a couple of outliers that are getting more than 15%, but whether you're large or small does not appear to be quite so much a trend in this particular formula for 2-year institutions as it did for the general academics.
Mr. Chairman, in terms of transfer, are we talking about transferring with an associate's degree into a 4-year institution, or what's the definition there?
I will ask the coordinating board staff of the governor's staff. My understanding was it was any transfer who started in a 2-year institution and completed 30 hours in a 4-year institution. Is that correct? Yep.
Thank you. That's fair, by the way, because we do have that situation right and left. The other question I have, if you look at Austin Community College and Green College, for example, they're right next to each other, and you look at the increase column, there's such a departure there. Can someone explain that? I look at Susan, of course, poor thing.
So what, Austin and Glenn?
And Glenn, Glenn's in College Station, right?
Right.
Glenn is in Brenham and College Station. Glenn actually has quite a few more transfer students than ACC. They transfer a whole lot more.
Is that what the variable is?
That's most of it, yes.
Okay. And so, for example, Austin Community College, on a year-to-year basis, does not have any increase in,
Some years they do, some years they don't. I mean,
it's pretty flat?
been relatively flat lately, yes.
Okay, so that's what that little, okay.
It's a zero.
So they have grown to their baseline to a comparable extent, but it looks like Glenn has especially grown in the last year.
And in terms of the increase, once we start, let's say that we establish this as a criteria, then that will become the baseline for the following year?
Their baseline would be 05, 06, 07 compared to the 08.
Right. So their success in this rewarding year would become
Part of their
a
base.
detriment
Yeah.
in the later year because it would increase the denominator.
Right.
Raise the bar.
Raise the bar.
Raise the bar.
Business terms.
Yeah. Right. And similarly, if Austin did spectacularly well in 06, then, and they didn't raise the bar further in 07, then they get penalized for their success in 06.
For example,
They should have waited till 07 to be.
so for example, North Harris is going by leaps and bounds. For example, if you look at that, they're now called Lone Star, by the way.
That's right, yeah.
This may be their year, and after that, it may tail off to some degree.
Right.
Which one was it? North Harris, Montgomery. That's been renamed to Lone Star. That's in the North Harris County, Montgomery County area.
Tomball, Woodland, Subtail.
Right. In terms of the increase column, again, the issue, if you look at most of the ones that are not being sustained by this are those that are small. So the effect is the same, is that they pretty much flattened out in terms of their population or enrollment, and nothing is shaking in that regard.
It just there hasn't been a large amount of change.
Yeah, and you can see it. I mean, if you look at the ones that have a blank there, with the exception of Austin Community College, they're pretty flat.
Well, of course, Clarendon College would be a notable exception
Right.
there, where it starts with such a small number. A small increase really is very dramatic and gives them a 20+%
21% gain.
reward, which may be very difficult to sustain for another year.
Sure.
And a lot of this, I mean, if you look at community colleges, a very high percentage are going to be, of attendees are going to be from the high school graduates within the area. I would assume, is that a correct statement, Robert?
To some degree, yes, sir. Our average population is the age of our population is 26 years of age, or a little bit higher than that. So it's a combination. It's high school, now because of tuition increases at the four-year institutions, we're getting more of the freshman class into community colleges. And then we're also getting workforce, people that are coming back into education.
But people aren't relocating.
No.
Right. So,
Community colleges are exactly that. They service that community.
and if you look at the coordinating boards, 10 districts, I believe 5 of them actually have predicted population declines in the college growing population. So we know where the growth is going to be. And my point is, if you're a community college, everybody comes from that area, you know, it's going to be, their growth is going to be driven or not driven based on where they're located. I mean, we know that in the Dallas-Fort Worth, certain parts of Dallas-Fort Worth, the Gulf Coast, South Texas is most of the growth, and some in Central Texas is most of the growth of the population of the college going for the foreseeable future. So some of these, even if they want to increase their enrollment, my point is, if they're in a declining area, they're going to be probably challenged to stay where they are.
Well, and that gets back to the community college mission, however, because they do a lot of workforce training and retraining and that sort of thing, especially in those local, the more rural local communities. And they do award certificates and that sort of thing.
Well, by the same token, let's say you don't have an at-risk population, but you could start recruiting for critical fields.
you could really hit hard in your area to see if you can get students to take the courses necessary to enhance that aspect of it, and it would increase your ability to incentivize that college. And again, some of the certificates are in critical fields, so that would definitely help them.
Let me ask a quick, Hurricane Rita whacked our Lamars, okay, pretty seriously, and we're just now recovering to some extent. How do you is that a worthwhile event to factor into these numbers?
Again, the whole purpose of this task force is to look at how to incentivize against success. I don't know if any extraneous factor would apply there, but that would be up to the governor's office. The point, though, is I think that what we have here is fairly equitable in terms of what we're doing. But the thing to understand is that if anyone is helping in the area of at-risk students, and especially in the at-risk area, it's community colleges. And so we need to look at that as the basis of making a decision in terms of whether this particular presentation is fair or not. If you will look at some of the factors here, those colleges that are located where there are more at-risk populations have more at-risk enrollment, obviously, and therefore they will be incentivized more than others. And that's what the disparity you're talking about, Woody, in terms of population, what kind of population constitutes that community. And so I think I submitted something at the last meeting saying that this might not be as equitable as we wanted to make it. We wanted to be fair to everyone. But because some of these colleges are dealing with populations that are more at risk or more focused on critical fields, they're probably going to be incentivized even more. High growth areas are going to be incentivized more because they're going to have increases in enrollment and obviously graduation. So this is, in trying to keep this simple, you have to understand what the conditions are as you make that decision. So the 3-year average for us is probably a better indicator of what's happening in community colleges. And it's probably, you need to look at that simply because of the spikes that we get in terms of enrollments and transfers and so on. I was very glad to see the definition for transfer, because we in fact get that after 1 year or after 1 semester, as the kids qualify to move into a 4-year institution like UTSA, for example, in our case, they leave us and move on. And
that's a success.
That's a success, yes, most certainly. And again, I'm very glad that that's provided for in this factor, because sometimes people don't understand the makeup of community colleges that way. They expect kids to go to get associate, and from associate move on. By the same token, for example, a certificate 2 student or certificate 1 student may get the certificate and decide, hey, I'm college material, and they'll come right back into the system and do get an associate. So there's a lot of variability there in terms of what happens with that population. That's what we're made of, and that's why we're so important to the state. So we provide that extra or second opportunity or an opportunity to get involved with higher ed.
Susan, going back to the question about Glenn, you mentioned that they had a big increase in transfers. You can increase your increase either by increasing the total number or by increasing the critical fields or whatever.
Right.
Was there also an increase in total number for Glenn, for example? It's just hard for me to imagine that you could have that 20% bonus or something, unless you actually had more students as well as
There will also be
shift in the type of student.
It looks like the majority of it was actually in critical fields and at-risk students. So they actually got a lot more on the weights.
There's also the issue of growth. I mean, again, going back to Lone Star, at Alamo Community Colleges, we're adding a new college this year, and we've got projected another one coming up. So there will be those kinds of enrollment spikes or population growth provisions there.
And I guess from a policy standpoint, if we ended up recommending a formula that's totally weighted on increase, it's going to be very responsive to those areas that have growth and are going to have to add capacity. Whereas if you do a total number of degrees, it's going to be not tilted toward, but it's certainly going to be more heavily weighted toward existing capacity. So that's just a policy discussion that we can have. But my point is, even at the four-year public universities, about 80% of the students stay within their area. So where those institutions are today and their ability to grow, it's driven to some significant factor by their location and the population growth is in that. So from a policy recommendation, the most sensitive number would be the increase. If we don't do the tiering, would be the increase. And that would be sending dollars to fast-growing institutions on your scale here, more so than if you weight it by degrees, which would be more reflective of the existing production
in the short term. Although if you took it over 20 years, then
and everybody, because the bar keeps raising, so that's correct. You'd be shifting to different. You'd really be following.
you'd be delaying your reward. Sort of.
You'd be following the path of growth in the state, which would change over time.
Well, we're now at a point that we need to make at least a tentative decision about the two-year schools. The first item to consider would be whether the weights are now condensed adequately compared to what we thought was too broad a variety of weights.
Move for approval, Mr. Chairman.
So there's a motion that these weights be adopted.
Second.
Any discussion? If not, we'll call for the vote. And again, I'd like to do it individually.
Four.
Four. Okay, carries unanimously. The second item, again, for our tentative decision or vote would be to weight the three-year average at 50% of the total, whether that total is 40 or 35 or 0, will be for somebody else to decide ultimately. Although we'll make a recommendation, and 50% for the weighted increase.
I'll move the motion.
Second.
Any discussion? Mr. Zarate? Vote?
Four.
So we have made that recommendation. Again, let me emphasize for fiscal year 2009. We do not have to consider the health institutions for fiscal year 2009. So I'm going to suggest then that we move forward for a discussion about fiscal year 2010 and onward, starting again with the general academics, then with the community or two-year institutions, but then also including the health, if not at this meeting, then at a future meeting.
Chairman, I'm sorry, I was remiss in not asking a question of the governor's staff. Mr. Roberts, the incentive funding that we're talking about, what relationship does it have to the funds that were vetoed for 09 for the community colleges?
No direct relationship, but there is an indirect relationship. That was a consideration. That was the consideration to expand the $100 million rider money going for university incentive funding to the two-year institutions. That was sort of a package deal.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I wonder if before we move on to our next phase, I guess, does it make sense that we confirm what we've already voted on and kind of close those doors and so we can then just focus on
Mr. Ray, influenced partly by Mr. Ryder and by Mr. Hunt, I was leaning toward revisiting what we've decided for 09 after we've considered what we want to do long term, so that we could weigh the consistency and compatibility of those two before we made a final decision.
But then would that open it up then to change our mind then on 09?
As far as I'm concerned, at our last meeting, we can ratify what our final recommendation is. And we can always change our mind until we adjourn the final time, which I think is due on June the 5th or something like that.
July 15th.
July 15th. Oh, do we have a meeting on July 15th?
No.
When is our last meeting?
No, it's June something.
June the 29th or something?
Two more, is that right?
June 5th, I think it's June 28th.
5th and June 28th or something like that. So, yes, I would like us to relook at everything we effectively decided on June 28th
All right.
and change or ratify, as the case may be. No point in committing yourself earlier than you have to. And now we might want to, at this point, consider whether we want to recommend the 20-80-40 or the 20-80-35, and so we could wrap up that part of the 2009. What's the wish of the committee at this point?
Mr. Chairman, I thought that determination was going to be made by the governor and the LBB working together. Am I incorrect about that?
That would, we want your recommendation. Yes, the final decision will be made at a higher level than David and me.
So to recapitulate, the 20-80-40 number was thrown out by me, and I'll tell you exactly what the basis was. I had heard that 20 million had been talked about in the Pink Building and in the governor's mansion. And 100 was on the table for general academics, and 100 minus 20 made 80. And then I had heard that two-year institutions should be included as well, potentially. And I made a rough calculation that a pro rata increase in the two-year institutions would be about 40 compared to 80 for the general academics. I'm assuming that the 20 for scholarships would go to 2 and 4-year institutions on an equal basis. That's what needs to be decided. So I came up with 40. And then Mr. Hunt, being a better arithmetician, is that the word? He's probably a better grammatician, isn't he? Calculated that 35 would be more close to the same percentage increase. And so those are where those numbers came from. The governor's staff reminded us that if that's what we recommended and the deciders decided that it was going to be less, they could always reduce any one part, or they could reduce everything pro rata. That would be their decision.
Would we want to make a recommendation that exceeds the 100, or would we be better off to recommend spending of the 100, which could include the community colleges, and then if there's a mind to increase it proportionately or disproportionately, the governor and the legislative budget board, that would be an issue for them? Or is it better to do what our chairman has recommended, that we start at 135 or 140 and let them reduce it?
I think that's for the committee to decide, unless there's any advice from the governor's staff.
We have a disagreement between the two of us. My position is that it really doesn't matter. 6 of one, half dozen of the other. If you go higher, then and the legislative leadership doesn't want to go that high, then they could prorate down. But if you do the $100 million, I think this would be David's position, you would then prorate it up or expand it up. So,
Half full, half, yes, David. The skeptic I am, I think it's easier to compromise and negotiate down than up.
So you would recommend going for what we think is needed in order to provide meaningful rewards/incentives?
Right.
works for me.
I guess my sense was if we really believe, which I do, in the community college needs to be included in the funding, we don't want to discriminate in the way we present it as if they're an add-on. In other words, we ought to make them integral, even though the rider was 100 and limited higher education. So that would fit in it either way. In other words, you could do it at 100, you could do it at 140, but would not want to present it in a way that here's 100, and now we're going to add, we recommend another 35 to go to community colleges. I just think if we really believe that's how the money ought to be spent, we shouldn't just differentiate in how we present it or vote on it.
And that's why I asked that question about the relationship between the incentive funding and the veto, because
because that has not been resolved yet. And if this incentive funding is going to be part of the package to reimburse community college districts, it'll just go to our base. It won't be really an incentive for community colleges. Now, that's just me being a little suspicious, but that's still something that's on the table. So that was why I asked that question.
What about if we formulated it this way? The rider explicitly says $100 million for general academics, including incentive funding and scholarships. And we could recommend that if that indeed is the distribution that's to be decided, that it be $80 million for incentive funding and $20 million for scholarships. But that if, as we have heard, there is a desire to fund two-year institutions as well, the reasonable pro rata amount would be an additional $40 million for the two-year institutions, including incentives and scholarships.
Can we make that our recommended?
And we could recommend that.
I would agree with it. But whatever recommendation we set out, I just want to get this on the table. Community colleges provide, they're 54% of all students enrolled in the state in higher education and community colleges. The overwhelming majority of them are at risk, and those colleges are having to put up programs that deal with at-risk populations. We also have a very significant number of our programs that deal with critical fields. So, you know, when you look at percentage in terms of funding and so on, I don't want to get greedy here because we weren't even part of the picture before, as everybody knows. But that is something to consider in your deliberations, that if you look at the goals of closing the gaps, if community colleges aren't there, those gaps are not going to be closed. And again, factor in the high tuition rates that there are now at some of our state institutions, four-year institutions, the lack of scholarships, the lack of support to some degree for students that are struggling, that the community college is taking to their fold, prepare them and move them on. And that work is going to continue for us. Now, we're doing this now, and we're not asking for incentive funding. We're working very hard. I think I've given you some examples of some projects that have been very successful in our area, in the Houston area and the Austin area. But again, that needs to be considered. If we're looking at the goals that the state has, the regional goals and state goals, in terms of increasing enrollments and in terms of success, and especially in areas of at-risk and critical fields, we're carrying a big load in terms of reaching those goals.
Could I hear once again why the community colleges were left out?
In the original $100 million rider, neither David or I were in the room when the budget conferees made their decision, but I believe that it has to do with the dollar amounts that were available for incentive funding, and they were being compared to the governor's original proposal. And I mean, when they just said $100 million is available, it was pretty much this is what we can provide for incentive funding, and then the rider was crafted with the universities because that approximated an amount of money that would be meaningful for the universities on a proportionate basis to impact their...
The same question might be asked, why were the health institutions left out? And again,
it would be exactly the same.
Just trying to hear intent, you know.
One comment on the closing the gaps goals. At least if I've looked at the numbers, we will not be able to close the gaps. It's not a matter of getting those that are participating today in higher education to succeed. It's getting those that aren't currently planning to participate in higher education to actually get them to participate. And that is the role of the community colleges. Mm-hmm. And so, otherwise we won't make it if we don't change the mindset.
Mr. Francis, if you look at the total allocation for higher education in the state of Texas, community colleges get 9 to 10% or to 11% of all funds allocated for higher education, period. Yet we have...
You have the tax base, right?
We have tax base, but most of the colleges you see on this column, There are 4 that are at 100%, the others are all in rollback situations. We're about to move into a rollback situation. We're very limited. And in fact, if you look at the historical data in the last 5 years in terms of bond issues for community colleges, we have been very unsuccessful. Some of us have gotten very lucky. We're one of them. We're in the middle of a $450 million CIP. We raised the tax by 3%. Right now, I just finished a retreat with our staff on our budget for 2009. We're about $35 million in the hole. And if we're going to continue to sustain the kind of programs that we're going to have, if we go back to the electorate for a tax increase, we'll immediately move into a rollback basis and have to fight that for about a year until we get some relief. So, again, when I came on this board, we were at about, I think it was like a 42% contribution from the state. It's down to 26% right now for us. So,
I believe the entire committee is in agreement that we want to recommend something for the two-year colleges. I would like to entertain a motion that will take the following form. If blank dollars is available for distribution, the task force recommends the following general distribution by category: blank dollars for scholarships, blank dollars for general academic campuses, blank dollars for two-year campuses. Those are 4 blanks. The last 3 need to add up to the first one. Does anyone want to make a motion?
So moved. Sure.
Well, you need to fill in the blanks.
Okay, we're gonna move in. Well, that gets back to, I would be more wanting to start with 100 and fill it out, 20, 40, or 40, or whatever 3.7% of GR is, whatever our first 3.7% of GR. That would be approximately 20 million, 40 some million, 30 some million to add up to 100 million. But I'd certainly also welcome an amendment that might want to add to come up with 135 million and go. I mean, that's the strategic piece, and I'm not sure I have the best advice.
And we have non-unanimous advice from our consultant. Does anyone want to make a motion that fills in the blanks? Well,
my only comment is if we're willing to take away from higher education, from the 4-year and give it to the community colleges, we're making a statement on how important we think that is, as opposed to making it look like an add-on where the first thing that could get peeled off would be the community colleges. So that's my only point for my thought process of laying it out that way.
My thought process on that is that the rider says $100 million should go to general academics, and that if we recommended less, they may get less.
Agree with that.
So let me make a motion. Can the chairman make a motion? I guess the chairman can decide.
Mr. Chairman, why don't we just go, I'll make the motion.
Okay.
I make the motion, the first blank be 140 million.
Okay. And the second blank for scholarships?
Oh, do I have to do the whole thing?
Yeah, let's do that.
All right. Boy, this is great. 20 million for scholarships,
Okay.
as the writer indicated, and then 50% for both the others, for whatever's left over.
What's left over, it would be 70 million and 60 million and 60. So we have a motion that would say, the task force recommends that if $140 million is available for distribution, the task force recommends the following distribution by categories: 20 million for scholarships, 60 million to general academics, and 60 million to the 2 years. Is there a second to that motion?
I'll second that.
Is there discussion?
I would say that would disproportionately allocate to the 2 years versus the 4 years. So, I mean, I would offer either a counter or an amendment, however you want to do it. That would be 135 million, total 20 million to the scholarships, and 80 million to the 4-year universities and 35 million to the community colleges. I think my intent is to get the same percentage of GR, which I think that's close, but people can figure that out.
I believe I'm going to have to rule that we're not yet ready for an amendment because we have not had a second to the motion. Is there a second?
Mr. Francis, a second.
I beg your pardon. Okay. So Mr. Hunt offers an amendment to the motion to substitute for 140, 2016, 60, the number is 135, 20, 80, and 35.
So that, then 140 what?
140 would become 135,
Okay.
and 20 would remain 20. General academics would become 80, and the 2 years would become 35. Is there a second to the amendment? If not, the amendment dies for lack of a second. Second, there is a second. Is there discussion on the amendment to the original motion?
Discussion is, just for clarification, the 20 million, Woody, is that just general academics or is that community colleges?
The 20% would be top 10%, and it's certainly acceptable to me that they, wherever they might choose to go. I think the intent was the scholarships would be for top 10%.
And I think it's top 10% for in academic and general academics.
Right, but the motion is that it be included, that any top 10% student who otherwise qualified for need who went to a 2-year college would also be included in that pool.
So that would be an all-inclusive pool, is what you're saying.
Woody, could you come back through your logic again?
Yeah, the logic is that 80 million equals 3.7% of the GR for our 35 4-year general academic institutions, and the 35 million equals 3.7% of the GR for our 2-year community colleges.
Okay, Roberto, what do you think?
My motion stands. I think I've given enough rationale.
I'm with you. I'm going to withdraw my second. Okay.
Kurt, I'm a little concerned about what we're doing here. Is it our obligation to determine how to disperse the 100 million, and shouldn't we do that and then talk about any other recommendation we want to make? I think we have to follow the provisions of the rider.
The governor's staff has indicated that we are not bound to only follow the provisions of the rider. My personal opinion is that, it's a personal opinion, not a ruling by the chair, that it would be wise for us to account for $100 million to the general academics and scholarships.
I agree with that. Yeah, I'd propose we limit the 100 million to the general academics, and then whatever we want to do to the community colleges, let's do 20 over 100 is 20%, so let's make 20% of the community college pool eligible for scholarships and figure out mathematically what that number is. If it's 40, then you're looking at what, 32 and 8 or whatever.
But if the 20 million is for top 10% scholarships, as Woody said, they can take that money anywhere they want.
Okay, right now we don't have a second for Mr. Amendment, and therefore I'll declare that.
Mr. Reagan.
I withdraw it, I'm sorry.
I withdraw.
I'm withdrawing here.
So we have nothing on the table.
All right, we're going to start all over. May I make a motion? I would move that we, the task force, vote that if $140 million is available for distribution, that we recommend that the distribution by category be $20 million for scholarships to top 10% students, $80 million for incentive funding to general academic campuses, and $40 million for incentive funding to community or 2-year institutions. That gives slightly more to the community colleges for reasons discussed.
I'll second that.
Any discussion?
Mr. Chairman, would the 20 million also include the scholarships, again, the top 10, I understand that they can go anywhere, but would there be any provision for scholarships to go from transfer students from 2-year institutions to 4-year institutions?
That is not included in the motion.
Okay.
The $40 million going to the 2-year institutions could be used for that.
Should we designate $5 million for that? You went from 35 to 40? Is that what you're aiming at?
You mean, say, 35 million as incentive funding for the 2-year, and then 5 million for transfer students?
Exactly.
But you're saying they pay it for that anyway.
Yeah, they can spend it for that anyway.
But as it is now, that 20 million goes to anybody, and I like that aspect of it. It's open, people can make choices, and that's, part of what this country is all about. And if they do come to, and they will, many of them will come to community colleges, because we're that accessible and affordable, so that's fine.
Mr. Chairman, I would, discussion point is, I still think, and I believe this right, the way the rider is drafted, that is all general academics. It's not community colleges. If we want to be consistent, I would suggest we consider exactly what you recommended, except splitting the 40 million into 8 million for scholarships, 32 million for incentive funding. That's keeping the same ratio. That's a 20% ratio. So if 40 million is the right number to get the 3.7%, let's break their scholarship money out in the same percentage that we're breaking out the general
That makes
academics.
sense.
So, which is 20%.
Review that for me.
Well, today, first deal is that 100 million will recommend that 20% of that go for top 10% scholarships, general academics. 80% is going for general academic incentive funding. If 40 million is the right number for community colleges, let's use the exact same ratio. Let's take 20% of that 40 million. Let's put 8 million in scholarship money. And let's put 32 million in.
Is that 8 million coming from the 20 million or coming from our 40?
They would coming from the incremental 40 million on top of the 100 million.
You're saying take the 40 million, but earmark 32 for incentive and 8 for scholarships.
Just keeping the same relationship in scholarships and incentive.
Well, are you suggesting that the 8 should be restricted for top 10% or any kind of scholarship that the 2-year institutions might want to, since there's no mandate in the rider for a particular kind of scholarship?
I would say any kind of scholarships, because I think still we haven't even talked about what we're going to recommend for scholarships. Yeah, we've heard a lot about top 10%, but I don't think that's outlined in the rider. It's just scholarships, is it not? It says top 10%. It does say top 10%.
Let me check on that. Lane, do you know off the top of your head?
It's top 10%.
Is it?
David and I were musing over here. The charge to the committee is to make recommendations on incentive funding, and the top 10% description is in the rider and still in effect. Your recommendation for the amount that should go to top 10% is appropriate, but for instance, if I was to take your numbers, I would say that in order to make it work into the task force charge, there would then be 28 going to top 10%, 80 to 4-year, and 32 to 2-year institutions. Do you agree with that? But taking 40 million for 2-year institutions and then just saying that 8 million or $5 million is for some undefined financial aid program is not within the charge of the task force.
Okay.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
All right. The motion and the second, which we're discussing now, has numbers of 140 million, total 20 million for top 10% scholarships, wherever they may go, 80 for general academics, and 40 for the 2-year institutions. Chair is open for a motion to amend those numbers if anyone wishes to amend them.
Did I hear move the 20 to 28, Wayne?
No.
No. No? Yes? No?
Well, if it wants to amend it.
I would move that we, because I think we've got to comply with the rider. The 100 million goes to general academics. That we would amend it to say 28 is top 10%, 80 million general academics, and 32 million to community colleges for incentive funding.
And 8 million to the top 10%?
be 28 million.
28 million?
It'd be the 20 million, Woody, plus the 8 million that I was trying to carve out but wouldn't fit into the parameters.
If the principal is pro rata increase and 35 is the right number, that would leave 25 rather than 28 for our top 10%, wherever they happen to go. And my guess is that there's going to be relatively more top 10% going to the 4-year schools than the 2-year schools, so probably work out okay.
The only way I would agree to that is if that scholarship money set aside would be or dedicated to 2-year associate degree students that are transferring to 4-year institutions. That would be very effective.
The governor's staff told us that
We cannot guarantee.
I understand.
although what goes to the junior colleges they could choose to use those funds to give scholarships to somebody transfer. So,
And I fully understand the concept, but we're dropping the number for community colleges.
true.
Mr. Chairman, I'm still having a hard time, because that's why I was trying to kind of close some door. I thought our last meeting, we agreed to the funding for the 100 million. And then we were going to take up 2-year college funding.
We agreed on the principles, but we did not vote on the distribution of 20, 80, and 40. We left that pending. That's what we're considering now.
The 20,
Above the 100 million, the proposal that I had thrown out that we did not vote on was that 20 would go for top 10% scholarships, 80 million for incentive funding for general academics, and then I proposed 40 million to the 2-year institutions. Mr. Noted that pro rata, that number would be 35 rather than 40. The motion that is now on the table is for 20, 80, and 40, and it has a second, but we're discussing whether we want to amend that.
I would still prefer to just do the 100 million, then we can do a second motion about what we think community colleges should receive in incentive funding. But let's fulfill our obligation to deal with 100 million.
thank you. Maybe you said it better than I did, so.
Well, and again, I agree with the commission in a way, but we need more clarity from the governor's office in terms of the rider. If that rider's been expanded, who gave that authority? And if that authority is there, then we can go to 140 million without any problem at all. But I haven't seen anything in writing either way, so.
Well, I'm going to guess, and this is probably an attorney general issue more than it's a gubernatorial issue, that the rider says 100 million to general academics. The legislative budget board, I believe, has the authority to take unexpended funds and transfer it. And what we would be doing is recommending that if an additional $35-40 million is available, that the LDB with the governor's concurrence transfer it for these purposes. Is that correct? That's the form it would take? Yes. And if we would like to vote on that in 2 parts, I'm very comfortable doing that and would be happy to withdraw my original motion. The seconder will withdraw their second. And then would entertain a motion for the distribution of $100 million to general academics, including top 10% scholarships.
See, that confused me, because again, I've asked 2 direct times that's on the record, whether community colleges were in the mix, and we are in the mix. So, at least I've been assured by the governor's office, so.
The community colleges are in the mix for this task force recommendation. They're not in the mix in the law.
And I understand that.
So, Dr. Paredes has suggested, therefore, that we make 2 separate recommendations, one conforming to the rider and a second one conforming to the desire to have the 2-year institutions be in the mix. And the previous motion and second have been withdrawn, and the chair will entertain a motion.
$100 million, as we discussed, $80 million going for incentive funding, and $20 million going for top 10% scholarships.
For general academics.
For general academics.
Is there a second to that motion? Is there further discussion? All in favor of that motion?
Against.
4. Four. Okay. Chair will entertain a motion that pertains to a recommendation relating to a distribution of funds to the two-year institution should the LBB and the governor determine that such funds are available, related to incentive funding and or scholarships.
So moved, Chairman.
How much are you moving?
40 million.
40 million. Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion. Second is ready.
Four.
Mr. Roberts and Mr. Young, does that meet our needs in this regard for the time being?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Moving on to the longer term and what we would recommend to the legislature for a long-term policy to adopt incentive funding. As I understand the charge, and here I seek again some guidance if it's available from the governor's office, the long-term charge does not pertain to scholarship funding. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So the legislature, of course, may decide to allocate scholarship funds, but we're not charged with recommending to them what they might do in that regard. So we can now take scholarships off the table. The legislature knows that issue, and they will deal with it as they wish. But we are asked to make recommendations about how and how much incentive funding should be allocated. And what we've discussed up till now for long term would be based on some combination of total degrees with or without graduate degrees to be included. So about just general academics now. Total degrees weighted for at-risk students in critical fields at some weighting. Increase in total degrees and our increase in weighted degrees. Right. And then we've also said there might be another factor not included for 2009 that relates to research dollars expended from external sources. There already are two different sources of funding for that, with three different pools of universities, some getting 4.5%, as it were, bonus for their externally funded research, some getting 11.5%, some getting 16%. And the 11.5% component, although the percent is not in statute, the principle is in statute, and it excludes the University of Texas at Austin, Texas A&M, and I think Prairie, but I'm not certain about that.
Well, there's one fund that does that. There's the Competitive Knowledge Fund,
Which is, that includes everybody.
Well, there you have to have $50 million of expenditures, which only
Anybody is eligible for, but only 4 qualify for.
well, at this moment, only 4 qualify for. So I guess my question is, since there's existing funds that are out there, but do I understand you're saying that that's one of our charges here, is to make recommendations that are separate from those funds, as far as new funds to be spent?
I think it's within our prerogative to make recommendations about incentive funding, which may be related to research expenditure.
Which could include the existing funds.
Which could include the existing funds or could be supplemental to the existing funds. Especially since the existing statute does not specify the amount of the existing funds. To start the discussion, I would submit to the committee that what we ought to do is strive for something that will provide a simple, predictable, sustainable, rewardable measure for which data is already, one or more measures for which data is already collected, that will incentivize the institutions to make long-term investments to achieve the goals that we want to reward. And toward that end, I would submit that just as rewarding enrollment through the existing enrollment formulas does indeed result in behavior changes, i.e. you go out and try to recruit more students to be enrolled. If you reward graduations, there will be investments made to make sure more of your enrolled students graduate in the long run. And if you reward more graduations, particularly with at-risk students or particularly within critical fields, then even more investments will be made for those long term. And if you want to incentivize the acquisition of external grant funds, then long-term investments will be made for that as well. And that a year-to-year increase is less important long-term than knowing that whatever year you get there, you're going to be rewarded as you get there. And you'll make that investment, even if you're not going to get the increase funding because you didn't see the return on the investment in a particular year, or even if there are ups and downs. But just as enrollment will increase or decrease, but you'll know you'll be rewarded for increasing enrollment net over the years, so too graduations. And in that regard, I therefore personally am attracted toward what the coordinating board's Formula Advisory Committee calls performance funding, which I would call another version of incentive funding, i.e. putting funding into graduations, whatever they are in any particular year, but with a bonus for at-risk students and with a bonus for critical fields. And as opposed to the ups and downs of an increase in any particular year, which might make institutions reluctant to make the long-term investments because they may not have the sustainability of continuing to hire and pay those counselors and tutors and whatever else it is that goes into it. And whether you call that performance funding or whether you call that incentive funding, to me doesn't matter. But I personally am wholeheartedly endorse the Formula Funding Advisory Committee's recommendation with one exception, and I think $100 million is too low. I think whether you call it performance or incentive, it needs to be more than that to incentivize real investments over the long run. And with that, I would invite discussion, and I don't think we're ready for a motion yet, but I would like to hear everybody's general opinions about how best to incentivize first graduations, especially in at-risk and critical field areas, and then later we'll talk about research, if that's all right.
Mr. Chairman, when you refer to the formula funding's recommendations, are you referring to exactly to what?
The coordinating board has a Formula Funding Advisory Committee. They recommended for the first time in history that I'm aware of that part of the formula be set aside for what they call performance funding rather than enrollment-driven formula, and that be based on the number of graduates with a 25% bonus for at-risk or critical fields, a 50% bonus if it's both, for the number of graduates in those areas. And that is the basic plot that I handed out at the start of the meeting. It shows how much $100 million would increase funding for the various institutions, and it varies from 1% more money to 5% more money. My personal opinion is that to motivate investments for this, the number ought to be at least twice that, and maybe more.
Should be what?
At least twice that, so that it could be from 2 to 10% or 3 to 15% more.
Does this reduce the base though, Commissioner? No.
No, I mean, my recommendation would be on top of the base.
On top of the base.
Mr. Chairman, I just come back that there's a difference between what the Commissioners Formula Advisory Committee recommended and what the Coordinating Board ended up recommending. And the only thing I would come back to there is that I would recommend that we consider looking at this long-term incentive funding pool being focused on just at-risk and critical fields, with the assumption or with the caveat that if our funding formula recommendations are approved by the legislature, it is already rewarding for total degrees and transfers, okay, with no weight, if I remember right. Susan, right? No weight. And the thought being not double compensating. If that is approved, right now there is, within the formula funding, there is, and we get confused in the terminologies, we call that performance funding. And that is for community colleges, and we recommended $178 million for community colleges, and we recommended $100 million for, $178 for general academics, $100 million for community colleges. And that was based upon total degrees produced, total transfers, okay? The thought being, if that is incorporated by the legislature within the formula funding going forward, my premise would be that we should focus our incentive funding recommendation on just at-risk and critical fields, and not do all degrees, and focus on those areas that are high need, high critical for the state.
Restate, if you could, with the 178 performance funding, but it's formula driven, but it's based on total number.
Well, what happened, Woody, in our recommendation, we recommended a new component to be added to I&O funding this year, and that is a separately segregated pool out of the formula.
But separate from the incentive funding that we're...
Separate from the incentive funding. We called it performance funding to try to differentiate between what we're doing over here in the formula and what we're being asked to do as a task force. That performance funding being focused purely on total number of degrees produced and or transfers from community colleges. We recommended a number of $178 million for the general academics and $100 million for community colleges.
Are you carving this money out of formula funding? Putting formula funding money at risk? It's part of, that's where you're getting your money from?
Well, it is a pool separate and apart from what would be funded by the formula.
In other words, you're recommending an increase to the regular I&O formula.
Okay,
right. In addition to that, you're recommending a supplemental
increase. This is
an
incremental amount to what we're recommending for the increase in I&O. That's exactly right.
And the second part,
the I&O, or instruction and operation, is the current formula based on enrollment, basically. It weights for different.
This is totally separate to your movement on the course, from course enrollment to course completion.
That's totally different.
That's the coordinating board and its committee recommended a substantial increase in the core I&O formula, and in addition recommended this so-called performance funding over and above that.
Okay.
Right. Now, my comment about that would be, I hate to say it, but in 22 years of observing the legislature, I have seen 22 years of the legislature not accepting the coordinating board's full recommendations. And I think if we assumed for our recommendation that the performance funding would be adopted merely because it was recommended, we would be missing an opportunity to add to what you've already recommended. And so I would hope that this committee would ask for exactly the same thing and more.
Is there any way that we can put your dollars in our bucket?
That's not our decision.
I mean, is that...
No. I don't think that's the case.
Okay.
I guess, trying to come at you, but what I would recommend is that, I don't disagree, you know, if the legislature comes back and says, we're not going to make a performance funding portion of base funding, then absolutely I agree we need to go back and look at all degrees. But I would like to see us consider structuring our recommendation focused on at-risk and critical fields contingent upon performance funding being put into place over on the formula funding side. If it doesn't, then we revert back to a total degree type of.
So in the five categories that I outlined, the total degrees weighted by at-risk in the critical field, the increase in at-risk in critical fields and research expenditures. Category number one, if it were already adopted because of the other thing, could be taken off the table if it was the right amount. But I think, personally, this committee ought to go on record as favoring that, whatever pocket it comes out of, just in case it doesn't pass, or in case the legislature adopts it but cuts it to 20 million.
I agree with that.
And we can note that the coordinating board has already recommended this, and this is the same principle, and we're recommending this much go to that, and it may be exactly the same number we end up recommending as the coordinating board. But that would just be added weight, I think, to the coordinating board.
Well, this gives me your explanation, a full understanding of how you got to your tiered percentages. Because if your performance funding is tied to total degrees, then your next step would be, well, how do I put more variability in there? And the tiered approach puts more variability than any of the other approaches that
We were looking at a two-legged approach.
And so I see all those pieces have come together, and the logic is stronger as assembled together than standing alone. I still think, getting back to other conversations, I'd have concerns on the tiered approach. I mean, just looking at the variability I mentioned before, went from 0 to 19% by institution as a percentage of GR, whereas the total degree approach is 1 to 6%, or 1.2 to 5.8. And the other approach, of course, the one that I've favored, is where you're focused on the total number of degree increase. It's in between. It's a 0 to 11%. So a little bit less volatility, certainly a little simpler, and it's fundamental understanding, communication to the legislature, understanding by everybody, all of the participants. Essentially, what we're saying is we'll pay for incremental degree. We're not going to pay you for what you're already doing, and particularly if you put your performance piece in place that is focused on total degree. So, at least my argument would be, if that passes, if that becomes accepted by the legislature, the next piece should be more incremental than that, which you've already indicated by your support of the tiered approach. So I would argue, at least, that we would be down to discussing for the incentive funding either a tiered approach or a focus on increase in degrees, in which we know every time there's an increase, the bar goes up, and that goes into your formula funding, whether it's for enrollment or whether it's performance related based on total number of graduates. And the incremental, this little 4% sliver that we have, is supposed to be directing itself to where we've got the greatest increases, the greatest growth, the greatest productivity. It could be natural increases because you're with the population, so you're lucky, or maybe you've got to be able to incite or invite people in, incentivize them to come because you're a more attractive, more productive institution. So there, I guess my suggestion or argument to the committee would be the focus on an increase in degrees over a 3-year rolling average is a simpler, easier sell, easily understood, if we can make it sustainable over time. In other words, none of these are going to be particularly attractive because you're going to CEOs of institutions, if they've got to make an investment to have a payoff, and if they know when that payoff is going to be increased degrees, but they don't know necessarily when it's going to be, they have to have some confidence that this is going to be sustainable over time.
And it's not only sustainable over time, but it's sustainable every year, because you can't hire somebody and fire them and hire them and fire them.
So, I mean, the dollars have got to almost be separated from the investment. Or you've got to be able to say, I have to have confidence I can invest for the next 3 years, knowing it's a 4-year process. In some cases, to get to a degree, this might be a 5, 6, 7-year payoff. Those funds have got to be available as I succeed, or it's just not going to be a sellable. So I don't know how structurally you deal with that, but that's got to be an integral part of the recommendation. So I would say, the message to me I'm receiving from the coordinating board on this layover piece, it's incentives, we need to truly incentivize behavior. But I would agree with the chairman that the tiered approach is harder to explain and gives greater variability than I think is necessary. And so I would be in kind of the middle approach there.
The other thing that I think is predictable is that the recommendation from the coordinating board, as I understand it, likely to be, will be for a very significant increase. And historically, the legislature, with recommendations for significant increases in a variety of compelling areas, has rarely, if ever, awarded the recommendation. They usually cut back. The general formula, the core I&O formula, is supposedly designed to cover the costs of offering the courses, providing the teachers in the classrooms. And the colleges will argue that the current rate and even the proposed rate is insufficient to cover the costs. And if then some of the general formula is proposed to be called a different name, and if it's perceived that that's somehow taking away from the core I&O formula, there will be a significant number of institutions who will calculate, do I do better if it's all in the traditional I&O, or do I do better if it's in the so-called performance core funding? And we'll calculate that 50% of them do better and 50% of them do worse, and we'll get back to the same old. As a debate about what the core funding should be. That's difficult enough, and it's going to be even more difficult if simultaneously there's a debate about should there be incentive funding, which just as there was at the last legislative session. And so for all of those reasons, because there are pressures to favor one versus the other pocket in which to put a limited amount of funds, I can't help but believe that if what we're trying to incentivize is more graduations today, tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, just as what we're trying to incentivize through another formula, the basic I&O formula, is more participation, more enrollment next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, that the simple way to achieve that is to say, you incentivize participation by giving money for enrolled students. You incentivize graduations for giving money for graduations. Not for one more graduation this year compared to last year, not penalized for one less, particularly this year than last year, or no gain. But you know if you get more graduations over the years, you're going to get more money over the years, and you will therefore invest to get more graduations over the years. And that you don't need to worry about any particular years up and down if you can truly provide a sustainable, predictable, meaningful reward at some point when what you invest pays off. And you don't have to worry about which year it is or whether it's up 1 year or down 1 year. But just as people make investments to try to recruit students to enroll, they will make investments to try to persuade students to graduate and to help them to graduate. And you don't need to separately incentivize a 1 year increase, leaning the institutions toward a quick fix, which then can't be sustained, but rather give them a long-term fix, which says, just go for it, and at the end of the day, whenever your day ends, then you're fine.
And I guess the counter, now you put that very well, is to take $80 million and spread it over the total number of graduates, and you end up, and Susan could tell us this, the incremental, per graduate is relatively small, measured in hundreds of dollars. If you focus it on the increase at the margin, so a marginal analysis, it could be $7,000 or $8,000. So the question is, you're trying to get a CEO to make investments, and how best are they going to analyze? Are they going to look at, well, over time, I'll lump to all my graduates towards this, a more predictable number for sure than the increases, but knowing that at the increase, at the margin, if I can be really successful, I can actually add another $7,000 or $8,000 per graduate to my GR. So, I mean, you can make a very strong argument either way.
Well, and as a university CEO, I can tell you, for a medical school, where the number of enrollees and the number of graduates is essentially the same, knowing that enrolling and graduating more medical students will be rewarded. Not this year when I make the investment, but 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 years down the road. And having that sort of as part of the system, we're more than willing to make that investment. If, on the other hand, there is a one-year opportunity to say, if you will increase your graduates by 20 people, in medical school terms, that's a large number, over the next 2 years, I will do my best to increase my graduates over the next 2 years, but I won't be making investments to sustain that. I'll be trying to get all those kids out within the next 2 years, even though some of them might do better to take 5 years to graduate.
But if you're running a general academic in a high-growth area with big population, and you know that 80% of the students that go to higher education are going to come to my institution there, and my population is growing, that gives you some confidence that you're going to get $8,000 per graduate to make the kind of upfront investments it takes to get there. So I think it's...
Well, I agree entirely, but I think whether it's a big increase this year and a small increase next year is more problematic than if it's an average over time.
There's more variability.
It's more variability, and you won't be willing to make the investment if you think you're going to have to cut back next year because I didn't sustain that increase in the third year.
Another way, if we could solve this issue of not having to spend all your money within the year, within the biennium, you have to take a longer measured return and say, I made the investment and my cash flow, so to speak, on the inside. On the outflow might be constant. On the inflow, there's going to be variability, which in the business world is not uncommon. But I'll be able to measure it over time, and as long as that variability's got an upward slope to it, I can accept I've got the capacity to deal with the variability.
Dr. Perez.
I have a philosophical question about this idea of trying to incentivizing simple graduation outcomes. And since I made the recommendation to the coordinating board, it's probably worthwhile to explain why I made a distinction between performance and incentive funding. My view is that graduating students is the most fundamental thing that universities do. And they ought not to have to be incentivized in order to focus on that as a primary goal. If that's not what universities are doing, I don't know what they're using their money for. It seemed to me that that's why we put some of the base funding in this category called performance. We know that universities have made significant gains in improving graduation outcomes simply by establishing that as their most basic priority. For example, in the University of Texas system, the chancellor said that presidents would be evaluated to a very large extent based on how they were doing in terms of graduation outcomes. And we have seen some substantial improvements in some of the UT campus graduation outcomes without any additional allocation of funds. They've reshuffled their current funds to focus on that priority. So to me, there seems to be something fundamentally philosophically wrong about creating incentives for what universities ought to be doing anyway. my idea about incentive funding, and I saw the performance funding aspect as a platform for incentive funding, is that institutions ought to be rewarded for doing something extraordinary. Now, we know, for example, that students who high need fields like engineering and basic science, we know that those students graduate at higher rates. Students who pronounce those as their majors the first year of college graduate at much higher rates than students who indicate other majors, but they don't graduate in science and in engineering. They migrate to other fields. So that the incentive funding could be used to keep, these students are presumably the brightest students on the campus, engaged in those fields that they initially indicated an interest in. Obviously, at-risk students, there are extraordinary steps that have to be taken in order to promote success among that category of students. So it seemed to me that incentive funding made sense for those categories, at-risk students and those category of majors, high demand. But that once again, that helping students become successful in graduating was so fundamental that institutions should consider that the most important part of their core mission.
The coordinating board's recommendation for how we would spend the 09 money, was it also the recommendation that you were recommending for 010 going forward?
We did not ask for a recommendation
on that. So do you have a recommendation? So you haven't formally adopted or voted on a recommendation for long-term incentives?
We were only in charge that 1 year, Woody.
Ray, I agree 100% with you, and I think the only difference is just a matter of definition of terms. I believe that the current formula is an incentive funding that incentivizes enrolling students.
Yeah, and I think
So perhaps it would be better, instead of talking about incentive funding, although that is our charge, I understand, to put it in terms of closing the gaps, where participation, success, and excellence are three related but distinct items. And participation means trying, enroll, give it a try. And that needs to be incentivized so that more kids give it a try. And then success means graduating, maybe with a certificate, maybe with a associate degree, maybe with a bachelor's degree, maybe with a PhD. And that's performance. You're performing, you're succeeding, you're getting results. And then there's excellence. And that's quality, and maybe that's research related, and maybe it's succeeding against the odds with an at-risk student, or succeeding against the odds with the really hard to fill fields. All of those need to be incentivized. And so I wouldn't get hung up on what we call incentive funding. It seems to me we need to recommend to the legislature and to the governor funding for those things that are currently not incentivized. Participation is incentivized and needs to be incentivized, and I think most of the universities would say it's not incentivized enough because those core costs aren't adequately covered. But in addition to that, and I would say even if it's not incentivized enough, we need also to incentivize success, performance, graduations, and we need to incentivize excellence, quality, taking those at risk and hard to fill fields and bringing them to fruition. And we're saying the same thing, but just applying different words. My worry is that we not overlook the core success, which is not currently incentivized, and assume that because the coordinating board recommending that a certain amount of money go to that it will therefore go to that.
Oh, we don't.
So I believe this committee should define incentive funding as including incentives for success, i.e. graduations, and incentives for excellence. And if they overlap with the coordinating board, then we're hitting it from two different angles. And I wouldn't get hung up on what's performance and what's incentive. We're incentivizing performance and excellence. And so I would like us to see total degrees be part of what we recommend, even if it duplicates what you recommended, and so much the better. Then there's a second question, and that is, do we incentivize those graduations by 1-year increases or by just the total amount of graduations, knowing that it has worked to incentivize participation, i.e. enrollment, by saying, we're not going to tier it, we're not going to give you an extra bonus for the increase this year or semester, we're going to give it on the number of semester hours you're teaching. And not worry about year-to-year variations. And I would submit that you'll motivate people as much and give them more confidence that they can succeed and make the investment pay off if you say, graduate more students. We don't care which year it's in, just graduate more students and you will be rewarded when they graduate. And that's the best 20-year plan as opposed to the best 1-year plan. For 1 year, no problem, I think. Do it now, do it quick. But if we want to ingrain this into the culture, it seems to me, say, graduate more students and you will get rewarded for it. And don't worry about the year-by-year variations, because once the university administrators start trying to figure out, well, if I graduate more this year, does that mean my denominator goes up and I'll get less money the next biennium? Then you're not going to get the investments you need.
If your performance funding is focused on total degrees and our incentive funding is on total degrees, and I know what you just said, Troy, but I mean, isn't that a mixed message to the legislature?
I think it is. I think also we know we're going to get a limited amount in those two pots, and what worries me is if we do get some amount over in the performance funding pool and we're covering all degrees, I would much rather have this pool focused on those critical fields and at-risk students. I mean,
that's why you came up with your tier.
I don't see why they're mutually exclusive. We could say we have these 5 categories we want to incentivize. The coordinating board has already recommended number 1, and if that's funded, you can drop that one off. Yeah.
I agree with that. I think that's the right approach. Okay. I didn't understand that.
Would you say you drop it off? In other words, if they're successful,
I mean, if the absolute graduations, it becomes part of the core formula, then that's taken care of. If it doesn't, we're still recommending it as what we're recommending.
And so then if it is taken care of, then it would drop out of the incentive funding and you weight it in a different way.
And you wouldn't have a different effect on that.
And maybe 178 million is the right number for that. So we'd recommend 178 million for category 1 and X million for category 2 and Y million for category 3 and so forth. But if the coordinating board's recommendation is fully funded and the 178 million is taken care of, then don't worry about that. But I would hate for us to assume it's going to be taken care of.
In the performance funding, is there also a provision for the health-related institutions and the community colleges?
Yes, for the reason that Kern mentioned. There's almost a direct one-to-one correspondence between enrollments and graduations.
Okay.
Community colleges, there is $100 million for the community.
I understood there was a figure there, but I didn't know if that was, we're talking about.
That's right.
And I know that this set of data was prepared for this meeting today. It'd be great to see what effect it would have on community colleges also, if we went into that.
That will,
and also help with
that's not the coordinator, that's the Formula Advisory Committee.
Formula Advisory Committee recommendation actually was more conservative than what the coordinating board recommended, because they recommended 100 million, you recommended 178 million.
Correct.
So these figures just bump them up that way.
Yeah, but they recommended a much larger sum of money for the funding enrollments.
Theirs was over on top of a big
The denominator was bigger as well than yours.
In the health area that are part of the general academics, they are a part of your performance funding?
The health institutions were not.
Well, but what about in general academics? We've got a lot of health within general academics, nursing schools, pharmacies, and allied health. Those would be a part of the general academic. But the health science centers that have some of those same programs or would not be a part of.
Health-related facilities do not have a
And there's a difference there too, because not at the graduate degree level, but the bachelor's degree level, the health institutions, nursing schools tend to be upper degrees,
Junior level partner for that, yeah.
whereas general academics is upper degree.
So those are just not on the list. And
I wonder if it would be, but Susan, would it be possible to get the analysis done of what the coordinating board's performance recommendations would result in, as a percent increase over what the INO formula is?
178?
Yeah.
If you take the 178 and 100 column, you have for both of them, if you just relate it back to baseline and the percentage.
Yes, so that what is the percentage? That 178 represents what percentage of the base funding by institution?
We've got it by institution, we just haven't related it back that way.
And that may become 1/5 of our recommendation.
I've got a 4:35 flight that I'm going to have to make or die.
All right. Would you like to make any kind of motion about anything before then?
No, I think if you could summarize where we are and then start there at the next meeting, I think that would serve me well.
All right. And please correct me if anybody has a different understanding, because we've done a lot of things. I believe where we are is that we've agreed that we will take the 50-50 approach for 2009 for weighted total degrees and weighted increases for both 2 years and general academics, and that we are recommending incentive funding, that the $100 million for 09 be divided into $20 million for top 10% scholarships and $80 million for general academic incentive fundings, and then another $40 million for the 2-year institutions. That for the going forward aspects of general academic recommendations, and here we may have some resolution still to come, that we either endorse or duplicate the coordinating board's recommendation that total degrees be rewarded / incentivized / get money for. That we could consider whether there also be some reward for annual increases each year, as opposed to just a total. That we would need to decide how much to weight the bonuses, whether it be at 1.25 times 1 or 2 times 1 or 3 times 1, and whether we weight the total degrees and the annual increase, or weight just the annual increase, or just the total degrees, or both. So it would be some combination of total degrees, at-risk and critical field total degrees, increases in total degrees, and increases in at-risk and critical field total degrees, and then in addition a research component, which is already funded in the general academics, but not so much in the others, and the amount that we would recommend there. Then when we get to the community colleges, the 2-year institutions, I would think the first 4 items would be exactly the same. Maybe not the same weightings, maybe not the same dollar apportionments, but the same issues. I would suggest probably not research expenditures for the 2-year campuses.
I would imagine.
When we get to the health, I think we would want to consider the same first 4, but probably would weigh much more heavily the research side relatively, but may not want to totally neglect the increased graduations, because that isn't important.
Not as important.
It's not as variable, but it is important. I would submit also that for the health, we want to add one other thing, and that is to incentivize the completion of training in a residency program leading to board certification. Right now, there is a formula, small but there, and new and growing, for having a resident that you're training. But if that resident drops out of training, then you've had participation but not success. And I would suggest that we ought to incentivize success, i.e. completion of the residency training and passage of the certification exam in that specialty.
So that's our agenda for next meeting?
And
Do we agree that if they're successful on their performance funding based on total degrees, that we would not be duplicating?
well, I think we might come up with a different number than they come up with. As what's the right number for that? I mean, they've said 178. We might say 200 million is the right number for that.
But if they're successful, and we're successful,
We wouldn't say 178 plus 200.
right. I mean, we focus the amount of money based on essentially the formula, whether it's called performance or called incentive.
Exactly.
And once that's satisfied, then if we've got more money left over, then we'd apply a more incentivizing approach.
Well, that would be my view.
Mr. Chairman, I'd also encourage us to go back and consider this innovation fund with funding we had thought about. And that, that gets us more into thinking regionally and the things. So I think we need to put that in as a
And that would be yet another pot.
Correct. Right. So, and I'll always make one more plea when we get to the final on even the 09 funding, because I really believe the capacity building is something, because we have no incentives to give at this point, but we can build some capacity, and that would be my argument, out of the 09 funds. Let me ask you one quick question, too.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the about out of the 09 funds.
The capacity, innovation, capacity building, when we revisit it for final approval, I'm going to make a plea one more time. We can't incentivize anything with 09. We're using data to sort of accomplish stuff, but we can build capacity for future.
When you come back and do that, will that be in addition to the 140, or?
No, it would be a part of it, like that. Is there any research-related incentive dollars today for our health science centers?
Yes, it's 1.5 cents on the dollar. So for every extra dollar you get from the NIH or from a drug company or from the American Heart Association or from a local philanthropist, the next biennium that you spend, you can't just get it, you have to spend it. The next biennium you get 1.5 cents on the dollar. That compares to 11.5 cents on the dollar through the Research and Development Fund. Does anyone want to go forward further today, or is this enough now?
I can't.
You can't. Well, let me request then that each of the committee members forward, either to me or to Wayne, we'll share it, your thoughts about those 5 categories.
Can you summarize that and get it to us, and then we'll...
Well, I can, but Wayne, David can.
Wayne can?
Yeah. And,
It'll be a day or so, but yes.
And if included in that, we could know what the coordinating board is recommending for core funding too, so we can see the relative. I mean, if we recommend twice as much for incentive funding as the core funding, that's silly. If we recommend 1%, then that's also silly.
Do you want to see the INO recommendation here, or just the incentive formula report? I mean, both the performance fund.
Both. Sure, too. Any other business or comments? Very good. We're adjourned.